Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Maintaining Mental Toughness, Being Responsive versus Reactive. My name is Gina Bryant, and I am the webinar facilitator for the Best and Brightest Companies to Work For. Before we begin, I just have a few quick announcements. Today's broadcast is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit with SHRM and HRCI. In order to receive your credits, please fill out the survey from SurveyMonkey that will be emailed to you later this afternoon. Our broadcast today is being recorded and will be available to view on the Best and Brightest website next week. If you have any questions during this broadcast, please use the chat feature you see in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. Our presenter today is Kent Sharkey, President and CEO at Alienate. In the company's 25-plus year history, Kent has been instrumental in growing the company to serve more than 260 organizations throughout the U.S., Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and Europe, providing health and wellness programs to nearly 1 million people. Under his leadership and driven pursuit of excellence, the Alienate team has assisted organizations of various sizes, including many Fortune 500 companies, to greatly reduce behavioral health care costs. Through his experience as a licensed psychotherapist and business professional, Kent is able to discuss behavioral health care issues and its impact on businesses. So please join me today in welcoming Mr. Kent Sharkey. Go ahead, Kent.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about something that's very important, particularly in our environment. So when we talk about, when we talk about mental toughness, what really is it? So it's a term that's been developed over the last few decades, particularly in the sporting arena, where we talked about superior athletes being mentally tough, not just physically. And over the last decade or so, the term has come into the business and professional arena in terms of being a corporate executive, if you will, and trying to win the gold medal. So mental toughness has a lot of different definitions for a lot of people. Today, what I hope to achieve is to give you both some nuggets that you can take out of this webinar that you use both in your personal life as well as in your professional life. So what does mental toughness look like? According to the research, there's about 30 factors that make up mental toughness. Now, elite athletes in generally have 12 of these characteristics. Just to list a few here: disciplined, resilience, an internal code of ethics, confidence, focus, being positive. Those are just a handful of the different strengths and attributes that make us mentally tough. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, we are in a unique situation with COVID-19. It was thrust upon us in a matter of a couple days. Our whole lives, both personally and professionally, were turned upside down. Tremendous amount of fear, tremendous amount of anxiety, depression, etc. Lots of emotions. And so on a scale, a bell-shaped curve, if you will, there are people that have been on both sides of that spectrum. There have been people that have felt confident regarding navigating through the COVID environment, optimistic that it wouldn't impact them. People that have been literally paralyzed with COVID-19 and haven't left their house for the last 3 months and don't plan on leaving it for the next 3 months. Most of us fell somewhere in between, but suffice to say that this COVID environment has provided lots of opportunity for us to test our mental toughness. Now that we're beginning to move back into the workforce, our employees are starting to come back, that'll provide even more opportunity for employees, management, and leaders to really address and to develop a new roadmap, since this has never occurred in our lifetime before, how they're going to interact with people. The Alliance provides services for many different types of organizations, large, medium, small, and every employer is wrestling with the idea in terms of what is our roadmap. And sure, we have CDC guidelines, the different states provide us some guidelines, but the bottom line is we're going to have to really use a judgment in the midst of those guidelines in terms of operating and navigating our new normal. So what did you learn about mental toughness? Now, as a kid, I learned from the John Wayne School of Child Rearing. And in the John Wayne School of Child Rearing, you learn a few things. One is you never feel, because that makes you weak and vulnerable. So parents tell us things like when we fall down and we scrape our knee and we go to them and we're crying and we're looking for comfort, oftentimes what we'll hear is, well, that doesn't hurt. And as a child, you're thinking, wow, it sure feels like it hurts. But maybe, my parents who brought me into the world know better. The other thing you learn in the John Wayne School of Child Rearing is you never ask for help, because that means you're weak and you're not independent. The third thing you learn is you never talk about problems, because that might make them real. So we learn how to deny a lot. You hear things like, quit crying before I give you something to cry about. Now, I have to tell you, as a licensed psychologist, I still don't know what that means. But somehow in that generation, those types of messages were very pervasive. And so the question to you on the phone and through this interview, through the webinar, is how do these messages that we learned as a child, how do they resonate in our personal lives today and in our professional lives? There's a strong mind-body connection. A lot of times people will think that emotions are separate from us and that it's a sign of weakness, perhaps, to show those or to feel those. But I'm here to tell you the reality is emotions are nothing more than a physiological chemical response in the body. They aren't some absurd, unusual thing that's baffling. They're not separate from us. They're part of our physiology. They're part of our brain chemistry. And true enough, emotions can be triggered consciously and unconsciously. And throughout our nervous system, when we begin to experience something, we're all familiar with the fight versus flight syndrome. Our body goes into a natural reaction, and neurotransmitters start to flood our body. Now, in an exciting situation, that can be very rewarding, or in a fearful or an anxiety situation, like we've experienced over the last 3 months, and we continue. Well beyond COVID, there are a number of things that are going on in our country and globally that create a tremendous amount of unrest and turbulence within us emotionally. You can see on the right side that what happens when we feel emotions, our blood pressure is impacted, our heart rate, perspiration, breathing, hormones are excreted, and those are physiological things. So there's a very strong mind-body connection. So what are emotions? As I mentioned, humans are hardwired to be both intellectually and emotionally intelligent. Just like an IQ, we have an EQ, or an emotional quotient. I'll talk a little bit later during the presentation about emotional intelligence, but it's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years. In fact, they're teaching emotional intelligence to children in schools in terms of conflict resolution, and they've had a lot of great success as a result of that. So emotions can be messy, but they can help us survive as well. They create commitment, they create bonding to working together and achieving things in a group that we can't achieve individually. Emotions are very instinctive as well. There's two parts of the brain. Well, there's lots of parts of the brain, but the two that I'm going to talk about is the cerebral cortex, which is the reasoning part, and the frontal of the brain. And then there's the amygdala, which is the more primitive part, which is more of the fear or reactionary part. So the front part of our brain oftentimes is responsive, whereas the back part of our brain is reactive or more instinctive. And we'll talk a little bit about how that impacts our day-to-day routines. So thank goodness there's emotions. Even though they're cumbersome, they tend to be messy at times, they create troubles, they really give a richness to life and give a deep meaning. A lot of times people perceive emotions are good or bad or feelings, and that's just a complete myth. An emotion can be comfortable or uncomfortable, but they're really not good or bad. In fact, physiologically, there's not much difference between the emotion of rage and the emotion of lust. Now, for sure, we feel and we perceive a very different definition. But from a physiological issue, our heart rate, our blood pressure, things of that nature, very common. So when we talk about naming our emotions, we're really not very good at that, most of us. And so you talk to people and you say, "Oh, how have you been, Joe?" And Joe says, "Oh, fine." And I just kind of shake my head, because when people say fine, which is not an emotion, it's an adjective, it describes something, I think about the letters F-I-N-E, so frantic, insecure, neurotic, and evasive. So next time you ask somebody how they're feeling and they tell you fine, you might want to challenge them a little bit about how are you really feeling. Now granted, many times we just ask that question out of social graces or small talk, and we're really not interested on how somebody is doing. That's a whole nother webinar. So emotions help guide us as part of survival. It appraises us of things that we need to be aware of. For many of us, we might meet somebody for the first time and we just don't like them. And it's not anything that they've said or anything that they've done. We just get like a spidey sense. The hair on the back of our neck goes up. We just don't trust them. And that's our kind of our gut instinct that is identifying this is a potential flight situation or a fight situation, or there's a third response that we really don't talk much about, and that's the freeze response. Now, any of you who have driven up north on I-75, you see that many deer get hit, and you think, well, geez, why do these deer get hit by cars? Are they not observant? Do they have poor eyesight? The reality is they tend to freeze. And so us as humans, instinctively, we also not just have a fight and flight reaction, but one of freeze as well. So let's talk a little bit about what are feelings. That might sound very elementary to many of you, but there's over 4,000 feelings in our culture alone. In some cultures, it's kind of interesting. There's not a word for certain feelings because they tend not to experience those. But here are a few very common ones: frustration, anxiety, anger, disappointment, stress, depression. There's also happiness. There's excitement. There's all kinds of other, what we would identify as comfortable feelings. So for some of you on this line, you have begun to have employees come back into the workplace For those of you that are in manufacturing, they've been back for a couple weeks. For many of you, I've heard recently that some employers are not going to have employees come back to work until January 1st of 2021. So as you can tell, there's a broad variety of responses to these feelings, as well as to the realities of COVID-19 that has no vaccination or real cure at this time. So briefly, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Humans being both physical and emotional, we have to survive, which is the basic needs, our physiological needs. Safety comes next, belongingness, and love needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization. It's interesting, many times during the outplacement services that we provide, some people decide through that process that, you know what, I'm going to retire early. And they believe they've achieved self-actualization. And many times what happens is actually they don't feel engaged, they haven't redefined their purpose, and they feel anything but self-actualized. So how each individual person defines those basic needs is interesting. So what motivates people? What are the key drivers? Well, the first one is pain and pleasure. Now, pain is a significant motivator, and it's really the avoidance of pain. Of course, we all seek pleasure in a variety of different ways, but those are the primary and very primitive drivers to our motivation. Hope and fear are also at the opposite ends of the spectrum, and acceptance and rejection. Now, sometimes people will debate that acceptance and rejection is a primary or a key driver. I think about in junior high when I went to a dance, the first thing you look for is people that you know. It's interesting, us as adults, so many years later, much greater level of confidence and social awareness, it's just instinctive that we seek out people that we know because we're accepted by them. The reality is we're all on the scale of motivation. So let's talk about, if all this is so simple, why don't people have better control over their emotions? I think about the conflict and the troubles in most relationships, and all relationships, I believe, have some level of conflict. In fact, the research indicates that marriages that stay together versus that end up in divorce or separation, they don't have less levels of conflict. It's just that those marriages that remain and that are providing successful interaction, they have better conflict resolution skills. And so I think about, well, why can't we just all read a book on conflict resolution skills? And if I was to quiz those of you online here, I'm sure you could tell me the textbook answers on how most effectively to resolve a conflict. There might be some variation, but I would venture to guess that we're pretty close. But then when it comes into practice, why would we not, and why have we not been able to do that in all occasions? And that's because we have two minds. If you think about it, we have one mind that thinks, or the irrational mind, and we have one mind that feels, or I refer to as the emotional mind. So when you think about heroic acts, you think about crimes of passion, these are the two factors that are in play. And depending on who you are, depending on what you've learned growing up, what you've seen from your role models, what your past experience has been, some people will lean more toward a thinking style of problem solving and some people will lean more to an emotional side. But the reality is we have both. And it's oftentimes the emotional mind is what gets us into hot water. So how do we avoid hot water? How do we avoid saying things after the fact? Ooh, I guess I really shouldn't have said that. Or, oh, geez, I can't believe I said that. Or I can't believe I did that. Because emotions have energy to them. If you think about the word locomotion, that means movement. And so emotions fuel behavior. And that's why sometimes we do things that later on, after our emotions have subsided, we think, oh, I wish I really wouldn't have said or did fill in the blank. So the key here is emotional regulation. And so why is that so challenging? Well, there's times when the emotional mind intensifies and it creates higher levels of physiological neurotransmitters firing in our brain. It increases our heart rate. It springs us into action. So for some people, they would argue, well, emotions are not effective. They don't help me. Perhaps somebody has a bad temper or a quick temper. And so they might attempt to say, you know what, I'm just going to suppress these emotions. These emotions are not helpful, and I'm just going to stifle them. Well, we can't really do that. What happens in those situations is we sort of suppress those, and then they kind of blow up, oftentimes at the most inopportune time. Anytime you see somebody pounding their fist on a table, whether that be in a personal life or in a professional life, which we still see on occasion, that's not about the person being in control of their emotions. That's about the emotions being in control of them. If you think about us, all of us get angry, all of us can be happy. We're in a mood 24/7. So we as humans are always in a mood. So let's talk a little bit about anger. Anger can be very seductive, particularly if people are feeling depressed, which there's a tremendous amount, there's an increase of depression. University of Michigan just conducted a 6-week study on depression through the COVID-19 pandemic, and they found that 52% of people are experiencing increased depression, 28% experiencing additional anxiety, and 22%, hold on to your seats here, are drinking and using marijuana more. I bet you never could have guessed that one, right? We have the University of Michigan to validate what we likely have already known. So the seduction of anger. I mentioned the fight and flight syndrome as well as the freeze syndrome. There's a rage, a rush of feelings that come into the body when somebody is feeling extreme anger. And it gives people a sense of control. It gives them a sense of power. It's energizing, a sense of invulnerability. Oftentimes in the clinical arena, psychologists will talk about anger is the other side of the coin of depression, or vice versa. That depression is anger turned inward. Now that's a broad generalization, and if people on the line are experiencing depression, I don't mean to trivialize it. It's very real. And depression can be both physiologically, have a physiological root cause, or an environmental root cause, or a combination of both. So it's something, our emotions, we just can't snap out of. Clint Eastwood says we boil at different degrees. So how our brain interprets a situation and responds, this is key when we're talking about being reactive or being responsive. Reaction is an instinctive response to a situation. if we respond, that tends to be more of a thinking process, more of a cognitive process. So this is what very spontaneously occurs. We have an event which triggers a thought. We have a perception based on that thought, which triggers a feeling, which motivates us because feelings are energy, and it motivates us to behave. And when we behave, there's a new event, or what I'm referring to as a response. So this is some of the neurological events that occur unconsciously, we're not even aware of. So how does this relate to real life on a day-to-day basis? So how anger escalates. Think about the person who's in rage. Once upon a time, they were annoyed, and that annoyance turned into an irritation, that turned into a frustration, that turned into an anger, that eventually reached a stage of rage. So in this example, we have an event, a coworker doesn't respond to your important email, call, or text. Our thought, he deliberately never answers me. And we shake our head while we think that. The perception is, I'm being disrespected again. So how do we feel based on that thought perception? We feel angry. We feel ticked off. Our motivation, okay, wait till you need something from me in a hurry. I'm going to drag my feet. Or a more extreme motivation might be revenge, to get even. So that motivation triggers a behavior. So we could either confront that person, that would be an aggressive style of behavior. We could have a behavior that's passive, and we could just ignore it and try to get the answer met by some other means. Or we could respond assertively, and next time we see the coworker, we say, you may not be aware of this, but I needed those numbers last Friday. I promised this client I would get that to them by 5 o'clock, and you blew off my call, my text, my email. I got to tell you, it felt deliberately. And so what happens is that person is your behavior is going to provoke a response. And so on and so on. So let's talk about the anatomy of an emotional or a neural hijacking. So we live in Michigan, for most of us that are online here, and there is construction season every year. It seems like all year, this year being no different. So finally we're able to get out from shelter in place. We're heading up north. We need some fresh air, some nature, some escape. And so we get on I-75 and somebody cuts us off. We know the lanes merge because they told us 3 miles back. Left lane will merge in 3 miles. And so we might wait another mile and move over into the right lane, so not to cause a bottleneck. But there's always that person whose time is so much more important than ours, who's trying to beat the system and tries to get up to the very end where the cars have to merge because the lane is cut off. So do you respond? Do you react to that? That's a personal choice. It probably depends on how many times this has happened. It probably depends on whether you're hungry, whether you've had a frustrating day, whether you have 6 kids in the car. It depends on a lot of different factors. But your reaction might be aggressive, passive-aggressive, assertive. It could be empathic. For all we know, that person's rushing to the hospital because they have a sick kid in the back of the car. Me and my wife have a we've been married for 27 years. We've known each other for 33. We're happily married, and I know that to be a fact because I check with her every year on our anniversary, and she tells me, yes, we're still happily married. So it's important to check in with your significant other. And so every year we talk about what it is that we can improve in our emotional relationship. And that's risky to do, but ultimately it's worked out very well. And so we're driving up north, and my wife is driving, and they've cut her off for the third or fourth time, and she decides to use some fancy sign language, which only encourages a reaction. Long story short, it was ineffective completely, and we really needed to just move on. So how do you do that? I'd like you to think about a time, if you'd like, close your eyes, the last time somebody really made you mad. Okay. Said something, did something, did not do something that they said they were going to do, seemingly deliberately made you mad. And so what was your reaction? Usually when people respond to us in a particular emotion, we respond back to them in a similar emotion. And so a debate that my wife and I have had over the years is that nobody makes you mad. And she says things like, don't give me that psychological, menargon. You make me mad sometimes. And so I go through the exercise of, and this is a real life situation that occurred. We're in a store. I'm late for a meeting. I'm in the express line. I have my 10 items or less. I'm paying with cash. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. And the person behind me hits the back of my heels with their cart. So I'm under pressure. I'm annoyed. I kind of take a step forward. It happens again. I'm thinking, really? Really? Is this happening? So my annoyance becomes frustration. It happens a third time. So now I'm going to be assertive. I'm going to turn around and say something like, can I help you? And so I do that, and it's a little old lady in a cart, and she says, I'm sorry, honey, I broke my hip. This is the first time I've been in the grocery store, and I don't know how to use this cart very well. So my feeling of anger that was caused in my mind and my perception from this person behind me now evaporates instantly. And in fact, I ended up taking her groceries to her car, helping put them in her car, getting her situated. And so really, did she make me angry, or did I choose to become angry because I had wrong information? So that's one way to prevent an emotional hijacking. So it's really about telling yourself a more logical story to explain the situation. So when somebody gets angry because somebody else is cutting them off, we don't know their situation. We don't know why they're in such a hurry. We fill in the blank. Sometimes a cooling off period, walking away. A lot of people have a difficult time with this at work or in their personal life because they want to hash it out. Well, sometimes that's not the best solution. I'm not saying ignore it and pretend like it never happened, but walk away, come back, calmer heads prevail. Exercise is an excellent way to work out angst because, again, emotions are chocked full of energy, and if we can, in a healthy way, do some vigorous exercise, collect our thoughts, burn some of that energy off, it helps the mind start working and the emotions getting under management. Okay. just briefly to talk about emotions have memories, okay? Since the various wars we've had, we talk a lot about the Army veterans coming back with PTSD, and those are probably the more extreme situations where memories impact people's day-to-day life. But there's other tragedies that we experience as humans through our childhood, through our adulthood, and they leave an indelible mark on our brain. There's a fair amount of neuro research that goes on that when we experience trauma, which many people have experienced trauma over the last several months, they've had loved ones that have died, who've been very sick, who have had been involved with racial injustice. There's lots of different things that have occurred. It tends to leave a memory. Now, memories tend to fade over time, but not always. So the other thing about memories is sometimes they're distorted. They're kind of sloppy. They don't have a lot of refinement. So sometimes what we remember may not actually be what occurred in its entirety. And I think to keep those memories alive and impacting us on a daily basis, we really kind of relive that trauma again and again. Aristotle says anybody can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person and in the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power and easy not to do. So it's a challenge. Being angry is probably the most destructive emotion. That's why I'm focusing so much on that. Let's talk a little bit about relationships. The number one most challenging relationship is the one that we have with ourselves. So depending on our childhood, our experiences, our coaches that we've had in the past, we always communicate all during the day with ourselves. We talk to ourselves. We are our own worst critic, as they say, and our own best psychologist. So that self-talk can really impact people and how their relationships, number one, with themselves, but number two, with their significant others or coworkers, how that impacts that. If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you probably don't understand it yourself. We get very complicated with our words as adults. Children are much more in touch with their feelings, not always having the ability to manage those, because to manage those is primarily a cognitive thing. And as children become adolescents and become young adults, they get a better control of managing those emotions. Communication challenges. Just to very briefly talk about this, what we communicate is so much more than the words we use. And we all know that. One of the things that's been very difficult for people over the pandemic has been the working from home, the isolation. Some people have loved it, most have not. And when you talk to people why that is, they don't get a lot of interaction. Right now, none of you can see what I look like. You can't see the sincerity in my face. You can get some of the tone that I'm using, but there's no eye contact, there's no body posture, and frankly, it's probably missing something versus if we were all at a conference and presenting this in person. So communication challenges are quite real. The second challenge in relationships is the lack of active listening. The number one interest in children is they want to be heard, and I don't think we lose that over time. People want to be listened to, and not just long enough to give them our rebuttal, they really want to be heard and understand. There seems to be something very human about that, even more so than agreeing with them. If somebody feels that you've heard them, you understand, agreement is not always necessary. But the type of active listening versus multitasking, so, are we checking emails? Are we looking at our phone? Are you like my young adults at home who watch TV, do their homework, and listen to music on the phone? They claim that doesn't impact their retention, but research shows that it does. When we multitask and we're less focused on a singular event, it impacts retention. So at times, why is it so difficult to resolve conflict? Again, because we have two minds, our rational mind and our emotional mind. So really the goal and the key, the takeaway from today is how do you regulate those? Because it is possible for people to learn how to become not less emotional, but how to manage and control and regulate those emotions, to come out when you want, not when they want, to be responsive versus reactive. Another variable in conflict resolution is the difference between aggression, assertiveness, and passivity, or passive aggressiveness. We all know people that say one thing and do another. That tends to be passive-aggressive behavior. So obviously, the best approach is to be assertive. It's not to try to be aggressive and dominate, okay? And for those of you that are in a leadership position, in a managerial position, you're going to have plenty of opportunity over the next few months of returning back to work to having discussions with your staff about perhaps why they need to come back, when they need to come back, what tasks they can do at home, what tasks they can't. And some of us, our management style might be authoritative, so we come across aggressive or controlling. For others, we might come across very passive and whatever you would like, regardless of how it may harm the company or the organization. The most effective approach is what we call at Uliance an adult conversation, and is to both air what it is you're feeling, what it is you're thinking, what are the challenges, and what are the potential solutions. And we try to negotiate a win-win scenario, which is not always the case, but as long as people know that you've made an honest effort to approach a situation to try to resolve it in an amicable way, that tends to go a very long way. Another big factor in terms of poor relationships is being competitive. I'm fiercely competitive with myself. I've played sports all my life. I started a company when I was 26 years old. We cover 1 million people internationally. I'm fiercely competitive, not in a group situation with other people, not in my family, not certainly within my marriage. That would be so counterproductive. But where competition is completely ineffective is when we try to gain control over other people. And let's face it, we all really want what we want, when we want it, and how we want it. Wouldn't the world be such a much better place to live if we could have that? The problem is there's winners and losers. And even if you're a winner on a compromise or a negotiation, if the other person feels like they've lost, believe you me, that's not going to be in your best interest. So let's talk a little bit about the role of emotions play in the workplace. So they're contagious. They're just utterly contagious. Think about your interaction in an elevator. If you just won a big deal, or it's your birthday, or something's happened really good to you, you're going to say hi to that person in the elevator, chances are. However, on a Friday afternoon, you've gotten your butt kicked all week, you've had some bad news, you're just looking down or maybe looking at the number when that elevator opens and just looking to get out of Dodge. So emotions are extremely contagious. When somebody begins to erupt in a very angry way, I get very calm, I get very quiet, which is not normal, by the way. That is an abnormal reaction. The normal reaction is when somebody gets in your face, you get back in their face. So to act abnormal or to have emotional control or self-management is really a key to resolving conflict in the workplace. So let's talk a little bit about leadership. Leaders set the tone, the emotional tone in an organization. If you're a plant manager and you're cranky and you came from the John Wayne School of Child Rearing, which is non-gender specific, it could be Joan Wayne as well. It's really just a group of factors that are very common generationally. They generate excitement, optimism, passion. That's going to be so important coming back to work. If you come back to work and you're one of those people that are like, oh gosh, I don't really want to be here, I prefer to work from home, I have a 45-minute drive both to and from work again, I'm in a position where I may be jeopardizing my health, that is going to catch on like wildfire. So your interaction, how you manage your emotions, is going to be significant. So let's very briefly here, we have just a brief amount of time. Most of the people on the line, I assume, know about emotional intelligence, the ability to be self-aware, to have self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. So under self-awareness, emotional insight, accurate self-assessment, resulting in self-confidence, we call these people intuitive. They can walk into a room and they can sense how they're feeling pretty quickly. The key here, you may be able to be aware, but if you don't have self-management, it doesn't do you much good with gaining mental toughness. So emotional self-regulation, impulse control. The biggest issue when we're feeling highly emotional is poor impulse control. That's when we do things that later on we wish we would have done differently or perhaps not at all. Discipline to achieve. Mental toughness takes a lot of discipline, which is not easy. It's a lot of work. What's easiest is to be not disciplined and just to allow things to occur in a passive manner. Now, the other side to emotional intelligence, there's ourself, of course, but then there's social awareness. So the ability to have empathy with people, okay? That's the care and concern. You don't always have to agree, but for people to know you get them, you get where they're coming from, and that, you know, you're sorry for their situation. You don't take responsibility for it because they're responsible for it. But that goes an awful long way within not only developing relationships, building them, but maintaining those. As I mentioned earlier, all relationships have a level of conflict. It's how we manage that makes us successful or not. And then relationship management is the fourth component. And this is where we influence our relationships. And only can you do that with trust. If you don't have trust in a relationship, you have zero influence. Conflict management, our ability to focus on solutions versus the problem. At Uliance, we use, under the EAP, a solution-focused counseling model. We spend 95% of our time talking about the solution and only 5% of the time talking about the problem. Conversely, many people that utilize the coaching and counseling solely want to talk about the problem, and they get stuck. They never get to move away. So my challenge to each of you who's attended this webinar is to break through your barriers to achieve your personal best. So give some thought in terms of what can you take away from this webinar. Is this just another informational webinar that you're going to forget in a day or two or a week? And research shows us that we have the attention span about 45 minutes. So I've already overgone the 45-minute attention span window. But what can you actually take away today? Either one thing, either in your personal life or your professional life, to make a difference. If you're expecting other people to improve your relationship, your expectations are going to go on for a very long time. The only one that can improve your relationships with yourself or with other people is you. That is all I have, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Hey, thanks, Kent. We do have a question that did come in. Do you think that personality testing, like the DISC or Enneagram, helps in dealing with conflict?
I think it does if you understand where the other person's coming from. So on a much broader level, if I know one of my staff are an introvert and I'm an extrovert, and they're thinking, will this guy ever shut up and listen to me? And I'm thinking, will they ever tell me what they're thinking and feeling? If I understand that, I can change my behavior. So I think any instrument that's valid and reliable, it first creates a group discussion. It creates an opportunity to understand people. There's a tremendous amount of things going on with racial injustice, with diversity. And diversity is not just our race, our color, creed, religion, gender. It's a diversity of thought as well. So any tool that helps us understand the perspective of somebody else, I think, is effective.
Great, thank you. Is there any other questions out there? Please put them in the chat feature. Okay. It was a wonderful presentation today. I just want to remind everyone that this was recorded. We will have it posted on the Best and Brightest website next week so that you can view the slides yourself. There will be a survey emailed to you later this afternoon. If you are in need of SHRM or HRCI credits, please fill that out. You will receive your certificate in about 7 to 10 days after that survey. Again, I want to thank everyone who came and participated today. Thank you, Kent, for the wonderful presentation. And I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Be safe and stay healthy.
Thanks, everyone, and be mentally tough.